Chapter 6. When anyone asked her if she liked Miss Blair's, Edith Stone said it was very nice. This wasn't true at all. She didn't like the dormitory, which smelled of caramels and throbbed with talk of menstruation and virginity. She didn't like the sweat and clatter and clumsy exertion of field hockey. She didn't like any of her courses or any of the other girls. There were several girls who admired her and sought her approval, but they laughed too much and they all wanted to talk about the same boring things. And there were no girls whom she admired or whose approval she sought. Dorset Academy, they would cry on hearing where her father taught, and then they would giggle behind their hands in order to leave no doubt of their opinion that Dorset was a funny school. Well, one of them said once in a tone of forgiveness, it can't be all bad if Gus Gerhardt goes there. He's a living dream. And that stayed in Edith's mind the next time she was home. Sitting beside her father in the refectory, she considered asking him to point out Gus Gerhardt to her, but decided it would be silly. Besides, she had only to glance around this table to see any number of perfectly nice, presentable boys, several of whom could be counted on for shy conversation if she felt like talking. Only a year ago she had hated these refectory dinners at Dorset. Now she looked forward to them. She liked the occasional afternoon teas with her mother, too. The guests usually included a witty English boy named Rhett Lear, who could make her laugh, and a big bashful boy named Art Jennings who blushed a lot. And once an extraordinary-looking boy had dropped in for a few minutes, drawing everyone's attention, making her weak and dumb until he smiled at her and introduced himself as Larry Gaines. Still, she had to spend 9/10 of her time in the oppressive tedium of Miss Blair's. Brushing her hair 100 strokes on each side every night, she would often stare into the mirror with a sense of helplessness. No matter how she held it, her face wasn't quite right. It had a nice oval shape on a long neck. Her brown eyes were set well apart, and her mouth, though possibly too big, was of the kind called sensual. The trouble was in her chin. It didn't jut. It wasn't pert. It didn't have the delicately firm, bony look of chins in every pretty face she had ever seen. Turning, examining her profile with a hand mirror, she could only hate the sight of it. "You're a lovely girl, Edith," her mother would say. But then everybody's mother said stuff like that. Besides, her mother had a decent chin. Even the most terrible girls at Miss Blair's had decent chins, so there was nothing to do but drop the hairbrush and the hand mirror on her bureau and pace the floor of her room with both small fists at her temples. On other nights, the mirror was more agreeable. Then she was sometimes able to see a romantic, even a mysterious girl there, a girl who didn't mind letting a heavy lock of hair fall over half her face, because throwing it back only emphasized the sparkle in the deep browns and whites of her eyes, the subtle shape of her generous, sensual mouth, and the proud column of her neck. At times like that, even her chin looked all right, and she would picture the apartment she planned to have as soon as possible, either in Cambridge or New York. A high white room with a guitar hung on the wall above the studio couch. She didn't yet know how to play a guitar, but there'd be time for everything. There would be a fireplace, too, and a coffee table with a wooden bowl of oranges. And she would move gracefully around wearing sandals, a man's shirt with the top several buttons unfastened, and a full skirt. Or better still, a pair of close-fitting, well-faded blue jeans. You ought to wear jeans more often, Edith," one of the girls had told her. "They look really sexy on you." One afternoon, when the weight of Miss Blair seemed too great to be borne, she took a navel orange off her bureau and left the dormitory and walked out across the campus, crunching raked pebbles decisively under her heels, offering only the most cursory nods of greeting to everyone she passed. She wanted to get away. There was a place she had gone to before at times like this, a grassy knoll hidden by trees from all the distant windows of the school, and overlooking one of the huge flat lawns that kept the campus away from the world. Sitting here, with her legs tucked up under her skirt, using the nails of her thumbs to peel her orange, she could be reasonably sure of privacy. All day she'd had difficulty in breathing. Her lungs felt tense and shallow, as if she might have to gasp for breath at any moment. Slowly, as to make it last, she began separating the segments of the orange and picking off the little white shreds from each one before eating it. She dried her fingers in the grass beside her thigh, and that made her think of a poet she had recently discovered named Edna St. Vincent Millay. God, I can push the grass apart and lay my finger on your heart. Well, I suppose that kind of thing can be affecting at your age, her father had said in the dry, tolerant, infuriating way that ruined all the talks they ever had about books. Later on, I expect you'll grow impatient with sentimentality. Most bright people do. Well, but I mean, what do you mean sentimentality, Daddy? And he had reached out to tussle her hair as if she were at 6 instead of 16. What do you mean, what do I mean, sentimentality, he said. What's the meaning of meaning? Ever think of that? Oh, your father's impossible, her mother had said with a shudder. Your father's so jaded and distant and cold, he doesn't like anybody at all. He doesn't even like Alice Duer Miller. Well, Edith said, because it always seemed necessary to clear the air in that house. As a matter of fact, I don't much like Alice Duer Miller either, Mother. And that caused her mother to look stricken. Have you no heart, then? Have you lost your heart like everyone else I've ever loved? Am I doomed, Edith? Am I doomed to die alone? Tell me. Tell me the truth. I can't live with lies. What was the meaning of meaning? As she chewed and swallowed the last of her orange, she stared out over the enormous lawn and watched the slow approach of a tractor pulling a rig of mowers in what was probably the first lawn mowing job of the year. The tractor shimmered and gave off a sound disproportionate to its size, a harsh thrumming that suited her mood because it suggested the ugliness of the world. The old German groundskeeper, Mr. Gerhardt, rode hunched over the wheel with the stub of a cigar in his dumb, grumpy mouth. Everything was ugly. There was no peace to be found even on this grass beneath these trees. She had just gotten to her feet to go back to the dorm because there was nothing else to do, when a Model T Ford pulled up to a stop on the road beside the lawn, and a broad-shouldered boy got out, wearing jeans and a blazing white T-shirt. He walked up to the idling tractor and said something to Mr. Gerhardt, who left the engine running and climbed down. There was a brief conference. Then the boy swung up onto the tractor and put it into gear, and the old man plodded out to the car and drove away. It had to be Gus Gerhardt. And all at once it became very important for Edith to get a closer look at him. She hurried down the slope and began walking. He was still many yards away, coming toward her. There was time to compose herself, and she willed her legs to slow down to a stroll. She could make out his blond, frowning face now, and as he came up close, she stopped, smiled, and waved to him. He gave her a hesitant, doubtful look. Then the terrible noise of the tractor swept past her in a great smell of gasoline, with the mowers racketing along behind it, and she was standing on cropped grass in which bugs were jumping. After a moment, he brought his machinery to a stop, cut the engine, and turned around in the high iron seat to peer back at her. "Did you want something?" he called. No, that's all right. I just... Huh? And all she could do was walk toward him over the stubble, feeling like a fool. "I just wanted to say hello, that's all," she said when they were within speaking distance. "I think I may have seen you a few times over at Dorset. I'm Edith Stone." "Oh, yeah." His smile was a fraction of a second too slow in breaking, and it looked guarded even then. "Yeah, I've seen you too sometimes in the refectory. Only thing is, I didn't recognize you." For what seemed at least 10 seconds, they had nothing to say. "Do you work over here often?" she asked at last. "Once in a while," he said, whenever my father needs the help." "Well, there certainly must be a lot of work to do around a place like this." "Yeah, well, nice to see you." "Yeah." And the noise of the tractor was deafening as he pulled slowly away. There was no peace in the world. There was no beauty. There was no air to breathe. There was nothing at all. That Friday, in her parents' house, Edith went to bed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and stayed there for 24 hours. At intervals, her mother would tiptoe into the room with anxious looks. "Dear, are you sure you don't want me to call the doctor?" "No, yes, I'm sure." "Well, but what do you suppose it could be?" "I told you, it's nothing. I just don't happen to feel like getting up." "But you haven't eaten anything at all since—" "I may have a glass of milk later on." "Oh, Edith, you're having one of your things, aren't you?" "I don't know. I really don't feel too much like talking, Mother." At last, when it was tea time on the second day, her mother came in looking bright and pretty and a little distracted, as if by flirtation. "Some of the boys are downstairs, Edith," she said. "I know they'd like to see you. Why don't you get up and come join us?" Edith rolled heavily away to face the wall, dragging the wrinkled bedclothes behind her. "Oh, come on," her mother said. "You'll feel better in no time. Lear's here. I know you like him. And Jennings and a few others, and oh, and Larry Gaines is here too." Edith rolled back, hoping the eagerness wouldn't show in her face, and said she guessed she might be down in a little while. "Oh, good, they'll be so pleased." As she hurried through a hot shower and then into the best dress she could find, Edith's heart beat so soundly and rapidly she could only assume that this was what happened when you rushed into activity after too long a rest. She had to stand at the top of the stairs for a long time, breathing hard, holding the newel post with both hands before she felt calm enough to go down. There was a great stirring of tweed and flannel as 5 or 6 boys got to their feet. There were bashful smiles and a ragged chorus of, "Hi, Edith." And there he was, looking older and more manly than any of the others, his head made golden in the afternoon light. Larry Gaines. "Can I get you some tea or something, Edith?" he said. Even then he seemed to know that she'd come down especially for him, that she wanted to talk to him, that she wanted to sit with him and watch his face. When they were settled together, hesitantly sipping tea, the other boys might as well have vanished from the room. "I hear you'll be going into the service soon, Larry," she said. "Well, it's not really the service, it's the Merchant Marine." "I know. Do they train you for that?" "Oh, not really. There's little or no training. You sign on and you ship out. That's about it." After a moment, he said, "I tried to enlist in all the regular branches, but they turned me down." "I know," she said. "I heard that too. Everything you do becomes common knowledge very quickly around here. I'm sure you're aware of that." And he blushed, just as if he were an ordinary boy, as if he weren't president of the student council and the most remarkable Dorset boy in anyone's memory. The surprising discovery that she could make him blush gave her a thrill of advantage, and she pressed it. "Well, maybe not everything you do," she said. I imagine even you must have a few secrets." "Oh, I don't know." He had recovered from the blush and was looking at her in a keen, self-confident way that might have been infuriating if she hadn't liked him so much. "I don't think I have any secrets. If I did, I'd probably tell them to you." "You would? Why?" "Because you're so nice, and because you're such a pretty girl." At dinner that night, he let the whole refectory see that he'd abandoned his place at the sixth form table in order to sit with her beside her father. "To what do we owe this honor, Larry?" her father inquired. "To the beauty and charm of your daughter, Dr. Stone," he said. Extraordinary things were happening to Edith. Sitting there, smiling and talking and forking down chicken noodle casserole, she could feel the tingling surface of her skin down the whole length of her body, under her clothes. She could have sworn she felt her very womb opening up. The word love kept occurring to her. "I'm falling in love," she thought. Oh God, I'm falling in love with Larry Gaines." When dinner was over, he didn't seem to mind anyone's noticing how he steered her clear of the crowd, walking with his warm hand cradling her elbow. Then he guided her away from the quadrangle, away from everyone, and out to the sandy area behind 4 building, where he gathered her up close and kissed her on the mouth for a long time. In 3 weeks, she would be 17, and this was the first time she had ever been kissed. Larry Gaines was overwhelming. He was brilliant. He was handsome. He was good. There was too much of him for Edith to comprehend all at once. All she knew, daydreaming and sleepwalking through the requirements of her time at Miss Blair's during the next few days, was that she was in love. Oh, Larry, she had rehearsed in whispers many times. Oh, Larry, I love you. She couldn't get home until the following Friday, and the ugly shock of that afternoon was that Larry Gaines didn't come to tea. He didn't come on Saturday either, and one of the other boys explained that this was because he was busy with his duties as chairman of the spring dance committee. The dance was only a week away. So now there were two terrible things to think about as she sat with her cooling tea in a room full of adolescent boys. She might not get to see Larry Gaines all weekend, and next week he might well show up for the dance with some sleek, lovely girl from his hometown. The thought of her bed upstairs was dismally tempting. She could have another long rest, but if she missed dinner, she would never know whether he might have come to sit at her father's table again. "Excuse me, did you say something?" she said to a skinny boy in an awful suit. "I just said I don't think we've met. My name's Bill Grove." And she managed to talk to him for a while. It was probably better than keeping silent. He was nice in an awkward way and so nervous, twisting his hands, shifting his chair, that he made her feel calm. "Do you have something to do with the student government?" she asked kindly, knowing he probably didn't. "Oh no," he said, "nothing like that. I'm the editor of the school paper is all, the Chronicle." "Oh, well, that must be very interesting." "Yeah, well, it's a lot of work, but it's pretty interesting." When it was time to leave, he waited until every other boy in the room had stood up. Then he rose and turned so quickly in such a flustered way that she couldn't help noticing what he had to hide. There was a big wobbling bulge in the front of his trousers. And she was embarrassed but shyly pleased. To think she could make a boy get that way just by sitting there, not moving around, not doing anything sexy at all, was enough to give her the self-confidence she'd lacked all day. In the refectory, everything turned out to be fine. Larry Gaines did come and sit with her. He talked to her all through the meal in an intimate, husky murmur that was probably born of his having kissed her last week. And in walking her back through the quadrangle, he asked her, shyly, if she would be his date at the spring dance. "I'd love to, Larry," she said. William Grove was reasonably sure she hadn't seen anything. He had stood up and turned away fast. The pants of his suit were amply pleated. Besides, nice girls didn't look for things like that. Even so, it troubled him for days. It was still on his mind when Bucky Ward came into the office to ask him if he planned to go to the dance as a stag. "Oh no," he said, I can't. What I mean is, I don't have a tuxedo." "Couldn't your mother send it up?" "No, I mean I don't have one." "Oh, well, look." And Ward explained that his older brother, now in the army, was about Grove's size. It wouldn't take more than a couple days to have his brother's old tuxedo sent up to school by mail, and it would probably fit. "Would that be okay? Because the thing is," he concluded, "I'd really like you to meet Polly, Bill. I'd like her to meet you, too." The tuxedo came just in time. It didn't fit, but the trouble was mainly in the overlarge neckband of the dress shirt, and Ward convinced Grove that an ordinary white shirt would work just as well. Nobody would notice. Then the girls arrived. They arrived all through the afternoon, meeting their dates outside the one-building archway and walking through the quadrangle under everyone's eyes. If they were made nervous by the scrutiny, by the clusters of walking or milling boys who stopped to stare, mouths partly open and partly smiling, they gave no sign of it. They looked and moved as if nothing in Dorset Academy could ever make them nervous, and they all had remarkably clean hair. A slender, graceful, pretty girl paced the flagstones with Pierre Van Loon. Before they reached 3 buildings, she hugged his arm and gave a thrilling laugh at something he'd said, while he trod along beside her with his toes pointed out as always, carrying her small suitcase. The watchers could only guess that Van Loon, however inconsequential he might be among boys, must be attractive to girls. Art Jennings had a tiny girl, which was odd because he was so big. And she looked like the kind of tiny girl who knew how to have a good time, which was odd too because he was so shy. Then came Steve Mackenzie with a girl everybody had to agree was stacked. Even in her tailored spring suit, you could see the proud fullness of her breasts and hips. And the funny part was that Mackenzie had lost all his customary aplomb. He looked miserably bashful at having to parade her past the observers. Another great surprise was that Henry Weaver had a girl, a real girl, not as pretty as some, but perfectly all right looking. A girl who clung to his arm and whose skirt switched nicely around her perfectly adequate, perfectly girl-like legs, just as though everybody didn't know that Henry Weaver was a queer. When Grove saw Bucky Ward emerge from the one-building archway with Polly Clark, he was careful not to stare. Her face was in shadow anyway at first, so he wasn't missing much. When he did look, he found she was trim and nice, neither beautiful enough nor fragile enough to warrant the rapt, almost religious gravity with which Ward steered her along. All the rugs and a great deal of furniture had been removed from the Needlers' big living room, which made it enormous. There seemed to be 100 girls, spectacular in their evening dresses, but there were probably more like 20. A small orchestra had been hired for the evening. They played simple arrangements of popular songs so smoothly and with such an emphasis on the rhythm section that even Grove felt he might be able to dance. But he remained paralyzed in the stag line along one wall until Bucky Ward danced up close and beckoned to him over Polly Clark's shoulder. "Oh," she said, holding up her sweet bare arms for him as Ward moved away. "You're Bill Grove. I've heard so much about you." "Well, I've certainly heard a lot about you, too." She was exactly the right size for him. With his hand in the small of her back and her clean, fragrant hair just under his cheek, he felt manly and strong. He wouldn't have admitted it to anyone for the world, but this was the first time he had ever held a girl in his arms. Turning, he discovered what couldn't have been seen from where he'd stood against the wall. 2 or 3 of the black windows on that side of the room were mottled with craning, grinning faces. Boys who were either too young or too shy to attend the dance. They might well be laughing at him. "Hey, look at Grove! Look at Grove!" But he abruptly decided he didn't care. "I'm afraid I don't dance very well," he said to Polly Clark. But she only tipped back her nice, smiling face and told him he was doing fine. That encouraged him to draw her closer, which she didn't seem to mind at all. "I think it's so nice that Bucky has a good friend," she was saying. "He hasn't ever really had very many friends. He was sick a lot when he was growing up, you know, and yeah, I know. And he never really had a normal childhood or anything." "Yeah." He had always wondered, watching dancing couples, what the man could possibly do to hide the inevitable erection. Now he was discovering that you didn't necessarily have to do anything. You could let it fill up against the girl until she would have to be a fool not to notice it. Then when it stood upright, you could use it as a brave and tender prod to suggest her every movement around the floor. "You mustn't apologize, Bill," she said. "Huh?" "I said you mustn't apologize for your dancing. You're doing beautifully." When Ward came back, tapping Grove's shoulder, Grove smiled at her and said, "See you later, Polly," and walked away. The jacket of Ward's brother's tuxedo was double-breasted. No one could see the 2 messins he brought back to the stag line, and suddenly it seemed very important to dance with as many girls as possible. The girl he wanted most was Edith Stone, but she looked so pleased with Larry Gaines that he wouldn't have dared. Besides, common sense made clear that he couldn't cut in on a 6th former. That left almost half the girls, and he made the most of his opportunity. "Oh, you're Pierre's roommate," Van Loon's girl said as Grove pressed her close. "It's very nice to meet you." Then he tried Jennings's tiny girl and 2 or 3 others. He felt like a proud, bold lover, a smooth conqueror of many girls in that dizzy room. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, he retired to the wall to wait it out. He knew he could never perform anything as intricate as that. And from the wall he found it unsettling to watch Henry Weaver and his girls sweep past like professional ballroom dancers. Weaver's big, soccer-playing legs were able to do every subtle thing the waltz required, and more. His nice-looking girl seemed wholly at ease as she whirled and floated at his will. But soon the music was simpler and slower, so he cut in on Bucky Ward again and took Polly Clark away. "Hello, Bill," she murmured as he settled his cheek against her damp temple. And he danced with her 3 or 4 more times until the band's slow opening strains of "Good Night, Sweetheart" announced that this would be the last number. After the first few bars of the song, somebody turned the lights off, and they were moving and swaying in darkness. Grove knew there must be a good deal of kissing and feeling up around the big room. He wanted to bend Polly Clark's head back and kiss her on the mouth, but lacked the nerve. Instead, he held her tight, and they moved only a little to the music, turning in place, and she seemed to be giving him as much of herself as the bondage of their clothing would allow. Over her shoulder, he saw the dim, tense shape of Bucky Ward on the sidelines, peering into the dark crowd looking for her. He considered giving her up, but decided against it almost at once and took her deep into the middle of the room, where they stood clasped and swaying. Shyly, but with a thrust of unmistakable pride, she canted her hips forward. He knew there was supposed to be a sweet, hard mound at the top of a girl's pussy, where the hair began, but he'd never truly expected to have it pressed and rubbing up against him to the moan of a saxophone. It was almost too much. "Dreams enfold you, in each one I'll hold you. Good night, sweetheart. Good night." Less than a week later, Grove found a small blue envelope behind the glass of his post office box. Ward, standing beside him, said, "Well, I see you got a letter," and then drifted away to let Grove read it in privacy. "I want to tell you again," Polly Clark had written in a neat, girlish hand, "how nice it was to meet you. Philadelphia isn't really very far from New York, so perhaps it might be possible for us to meet again sometime." There was an inconsequential paragraph, and then, "I am fond of Bucky, but he doesn't own me. I hope you will understand what I'm trying to..." Grove finished the letter quickly and stuffed it into his pocket, beginning to feel like a devil of a fellow. He avoided Ward for the rest of the day until Ward cornered him late that afternoon in the senior club. "So what'd she say?" he asked. "Huh?" Grove felt his face getting warm. "Come on, I'd know that handwriting anywhere. What'd she say?" "Nothing much. She just said it was nice to meet me and stuff like that." "You gonna write back?" "Well, I guess so." Ward looked as if he were enduring physical pain. "It's entirely up to you," he said. "Whether you write back or not, is entirely up to you." Then he turned and walked away past the pool table, carrying his shoulders high. "No, listen, hey, Bucky," Grove said, starting after him. "Listen, wait a minute." "Want to talk about it?" Ward said, not looking at him. "Want to go outside?" The bench behind the club was vacant, so they sat there in silence for a long time, smoking, while the delicate moral question hung in the air. Grove knew he would probably give in. There seemed no other way to conclude this business, but he wanted to let the tension last a while. He wanted to savor his power over Ward as the minutes of silence went by. And Ward seemed to be enjoying himself too in a wretched way. In the end, it was Grove's impatience with Ward's apparent pleasure that made him say, "Look, I won't write to her if you don't want me to." "It can't be because I don't want you to. Don't you see that?" "Well, then it's because I don't want to," Grove said. "Okay?" "Okay," Ward said. "Okay, thanks." He looked as though he regretted saying thanks, but it was too late. And not until an hour later, walking alone and thinking of Polly Clark, did Grove begin to feel a sense of loss. Another difficulty arose between them that very next week. It was the time of double room assignments again, and Grove had scored a quiet triumph. Hugh Britt had agreed, with almost no discussion at all, to be his roommate in the coming year. It had occurred to him that Ward might be a little hurt or jealous, but he wasn't ready for the look on Ward's face when they happened to meet outside 3 building. It turned out to be even worse than the crisis over Polly's letter. "Let's take a walk," Ward mumbled, and they walked a great distance, out past the infirmary and into the woods and down a long hill until they came to a small wooden bridge across the glittering stream. It was a lovely spot, the kind of place where lovers might meet to discuss the impossibility of their situation, only to fall into each other's arms in the end. And that was the trouble. It was a place for lovers, not for anything as puerile as a sad, silent display of Bucky Ward's hurt feelings. "Here's the thing, Bill," Ward said after a very long time. "When I saw your name and Britt's on the double room list, I felt let down, that's all." "Yeah, well, I'm sorry you felt that way. The point is, I thought you and I were, the best of friends, and I more or less assumed we'd be roommates together, that's all." Grove didn't know what to say. He wanted to assure Ward that they were still the best of friends, but he would be damned if he'd let Ward change his mind about rooming with Britt. He thought of Polly Clark's line, "He doesn't own me," and felt as if Ward were trying to own him too. Above all, he resented having been brought to such a romantic place for such an embarrassing conversation. And that made it all the worse when Larry Gaines and Edith Stone emerged through the trees holding hands, walking slowly on their way back to school. Here was a real romance, with real lovers, and it made a mockery of whatever the hell else was taking place. There were shy greetings. "Hi." "Hi." Then Larry Gaines and Edith Stone walked over the little bridge and continued up toward the campus. Edith had hoped it might happen that afternoon. In the clearing, she had taken him to beyond the bridge, but all they'd done there for the most part was sit and talk. This was the 3rd or 4th time she had hoped it might happen, and it hadn't. Larry liked to talk a lot, in a low, intimate voice, and he liked to kiss, often cupping one of her breasts in his hand while kissing. Sometimes, too, he would run one hand down her back and let the other feel its way up the inside of her thigh, but he always stopped short. He always broke away from her with a heavy sigh and said something like, "Oh God, I love you, Edith." And she was quick to answer that she loved him too, that she loved him terribly. But it was as if these declarations were all he needed. She knew there ought to be more. There would absolutely have to be more in the very few days that remained before he went to sea. Then suddenly it was his last night at school. Tomorrow he would go to New York wearing the seaman's clothes he had chosen for himself, the costume he was self-consciously modeling now in the Stones' house for Edith and her parents, for the Robert Driscolls, and for a roomful of admiring boys. A new Levi jacket and pants, a knitted navy blue watch cap worn low over one eyebrow, and rubber-soled work shoes. "You look like you're on the high seas already, Larry," Robert Driscoll said. "You look as though nothing less than a German submarine could ever bother you." Soon the other boys went back to the dormitories. The Driscolls went home, and it was time for Dr. and Mrs. Stone to go upstairs. "Well, Larry, we certainly wish you luck," Dr. Stone said, shaking hands with him, "and we're going to miss you." "Thank you, sir." And Larry and Edith were alone. They began at once to clasp and writhe together until Edith said, "Wasn't there somewhere we can go?" Larry Gaines thought it over. "Okay," he said at last, "we can go to the senior club." But all the way out across the quadrangle, with his arm around her, he had to fight a rising sense of panic. He was a virgin. His plan all along had been to lose it with some nameless girl in Algiers or wherever the Merchant Marine might take him. He had even thought he might contrive to develop a wide range of sexual techniques before coming home to Edith. But that excellent idea was closed to him now because she was crowding him. She wanted it. She wouldn't settle for anything less. For more than a year, he had kept an illustrated marriage manual among folded sheets in the linen bin beneath his bed, but he hadn't been able to learn much from it because whenever he read those lubricious paragraphs, in combination with those pictures, he would find himself helplessly masturbating. And he'd feel so rotten afterwards. Was the president of the student council really supposed to jerk off? that he would hide the book away again and swear off it entirely until the next time. Now for courage, or for luck, he said, "I love you, Edith," as they walked under the dark trees, and she replied, as always, that she loved him too. The senior club was filled with moonlight and shadows. The blue-gray scent of many cigarettes hung in the air, and around the leather sofa at the fireplace there was a faint, lingering tang of wood smoke from all the log fires of the winter and spring. Edith stepped out of her shoes, that in itself was a pretty thing to watch, and put both hands behind her back to unfasten the hooks of her dress, letting a heavy lock of hair fall over half her face as she worked. He fought his way free of the seaman's clothes, remembering only at the last moment to snatch the damned watch cap from his head. Then he and Edith were naked and embracing and moving to the sofa, where he helped her to lie back on the wide, slick cushions, and he began to know from the very feel of her flesh in his hands that it was going to be all right. At his first real thrust, she gave a little whimpering cry that could have been pain or pleasure, or both, or neither, and he almost stopped to say, "Are you okay?" But didn't, because it seemed much better to keep going, to build and sustain a rhythm that would bring her along with him. And, well, yes, now she was getting it, and soon nothing mattered at all but the strength and purity of their coupling. It could have been midnight or noon. The senior club and the whole of Dorset Academy could have evaporated into the trees, and even the trees could have vanished, for all they knew. They had overcome time and space in their need to help each other arrive at the heart of the world. In the long aftermath, they lay whispering together, saying things nobody else would ever be privileged to hear, and very gradually their circumstances closed in around them again. A smoking club, a preparatory school, a train that would have to be caught at 8 o'clock in the morning. "Can't find my cap," he muttered when he was dressed, groping along the shadowed floor. "Oh, you've got to find the cap, Larry. It's adorable." "What do you mean, adorable?" "You think that's something only silly girls ever say?" "Well, I don't mind. From now on, I'm going to be the silliest girl in the world, and you're going to love me anyway." "Hey, Larry?" "Yeah?" "Here it is. Your watch cap. It was in the fireplace." "What the hell was it doing in the fireplace?" "I don't know, but if you're really glad I found it, you know what you could do? You could come over here and hold me again for a minute. Just for a minute." There were 10 or 15 minutes before, or more, at the moonlight door of her house, where they stood promising to write and to wait, saying again and again what each thought the other might most want to hear. "Okay, baby," he kept murmuring against her lips or in her hair before he left her. "Okay, baby, okay." Walking back to his room, he realized he had never called a girl baby before, and that alone, not to mention the astonishing impact of everything else, made him feel remarkably like a man. There was little or no training. Less than 2 weeks after he left school, Larry Gaines signed on and shipped out as one of the 30-man crew aboard a tanker bound for North Africa, and riding low in the sea with its weight of military gasoline. 10 miles out of New York Harbor at about 2 in the morning, for reasons never investigated or explained, the tanker accidentally caught fire and exploded. There were no survivors. It took several days for the news to reach Dorset Academy, and then it didn't break all at once. It crept and darted around the quadrangle from one cluster of stunned, unbelieving listeners to another. It seeped into faculty houses and into the kitchens of faculty wives. It went in and around and out of the infirmary and down to the baseball diamond and over to the track and back up to the senior club. More than a few people felt their faces twitch into foolish little smiles of incredulity on hearing it. Smiles quickly covered with their hands. I can't believe it," they said again and again. "Larry Gaines?" And by 3 or 4 that afternoon, everyone knew. "He must have been asleep when it happened," Robert Driscoll said, hunched on his bed with his head in his hands while his wife massaged his neck and shoulders. The whole crew must have been asleep at that time of night, except for whoever dropped the fucking cigarette or fucked around with the fucking fuse box or whatever the fuck it is you have to do to make a whole fucking ship blow up. And oh, Jesus Christ almighty, Marge. Jesus fucking Christ almighty. I know, dear, she said, I know. Myra Stone sat alone in her living room, twisting a moist handkerchief tight in her lap and feeling abandoned by everyone she had ever loved. Was this how things turned out in life? That you weren't even allowed to comfort your child in her grief because your husband said you were too upset yourself? Would everything always be this way? Would there never be an end to the pain of this rejection and this terrible, terrible loneliness? Edith had been put to bed upstairs with what the doctor called a heavy sedative, but it wasn't working. Every 15 or 20 minutes, she would struggle upright, rubbing the heel of her hands into her face as if to rid herself of sleep, and say, oh. Her eyes and mouth in those moments looked as though she might be losing her mind. And her father would take her in his arms and help her to lie back on the pillow until she was still. You have your whole life, Edith, he would say each time. You have your whole life. Up in the Chronicle office, the air was thick with smoke and dedication. Mr. Gold had agreed to break open the front page of the commencement issue for a 2-column, 3-inch, heavy black-bordered box, and he'd agreed to hand-set the type himself. But he had to have the copy by 5 o'clock, and there were only 20 minutes left. Grove had written 4 drafts, but Britt had found something wrong with all of them. Grove, you can't use as we go to press about a thing like this. Don't you see that? For an hour they had bickered and quarreled and thrown crumpled paper on the floor. Then Britt had loftily agreed to try his own version and frowned over his pencil in enviable concentration, using his free hand to shield his work from Grove's eyes. No, he said at last and began tearing up. Hey, come on, Britt. Can't I even read the fucking thing? What's the point? It isn't any good. It isn't any better than any of yours. Besides, it's not my job to do this. You're the editor. You do it. Shit, Grove said. Shit. He was close to tears of frustration and fatigue, but the high calling of letters brooked no compromise. He sat down with a clean sheet of paper and the only pencil on the desk that wasn't broken or dull. He knew Britt would be crouched at his shoulder watching every word, so he wrote the words with an exaggerated care for their legibility. It is a dark commencement for the class of 1943. Lawrence Mason Gaines, the outstanding member of that class and one of the finest young men Dorset Academy has ever known, died in the service of his country last week. He was 18 years old. That's it, Britt said quietly. That's it. Now the second paragraph. You're getting it, Bill. You're getting it. Chapter 7. In the following fall, the class of 1944 were suddenly sixth formers, seniors, and most of them didn't feel up to it. Seniors had always been manly and dignified, fit companions for someone like Larry Gaines, and those standards seemed impossible to meet. A few did well. Hugh Britt had been elected to the student council and was a model school leader, though some found him a little aloof. Jim Pomeroy and Steve McKenzie were on the council too, as was Gus Gerhardt. Anyone with the bulk, the athletic prowess, and the blunt good looks of Gus Gerhardt would always be a natural for the council, even if, as in Gerhardt's case, he was a slow and sullen bully. The presidency of the council was an unconventional choice that year. It went to a short, tussle-haired boy named Dave Hutchins, who was only moderately gifted at sports or studies, who looked younger than his age and didn't seem altogether sure of himself. His distinction was that everybody liked him, and he had drawn an unusually heavy vote from the lower forms. I know you're busy, Dave Hutchins said as he followed Grove upstairs to the Chronicle office one October afternoon. But the thing is, I was wondering if you might have time to help me with this speech I have to make. I think I've got it pretty well organized, but it needs a little help. Sure, Grove said, more flattered than he would have been willing to admit. Let's take a look at it. In the office, they found Lothar Brundle sitting alone, looking up from the strewn pages of his humor column. Hutchins and Brundles had been close friends since they were both 14 in the third form, and they'd roomed together last year, but this year, in keeping with his position as top boy of the school, Hutchins had chosen to room with Gus Gerhardt. Grove watched closely for signs of awkwardness in their greeting but found none, and he guessed this was because nobody as nice as Brundles could hold a grudge against anybody as nice as Hutchins. That was one of the funny things Grove had begun to learn about the senior class. The guys were nice to each other. There wasn't even any open scorn for Henry Weaver or for the one or two other class pariahs, though of course those people were expected to be nice enough themselves to keep their distance. "What's this speech of yours, Dave?" Brundles asked. "Ah, neither wants me to do it. It's all about the financial trouble we're in, the school's in, I mean. He'll be making the main speech when the parents come for Thanksgiving, and he wants me to make a little one. Nothing big. He gave me the general theme. If we fail." And he must have talked for half an hour about the rest of it, but I swear I didn't understand a goddamn thing he said. Grove was going over Hutchins's 3-page manuscript. "Know what you might do, Dave?" he said. "You might work in that Shakespeare business." "What Shakespeare business?" "You know, from from Macbeth. And if we fail?" "We fail, but screw your courage to the sticking place, and we'll not fail." I don't know," Hutchins said. "I don't like that. I don't like screw your courage." "Besides, it's all wrong, Grove," Lothar Brundle said. "The people in the play are plotting a murder, for Christ's sake. Don't you see the difference?" In the end, they got Hutchins's speech into reasonably good shape. The parents at Thanksgiving would be made to understand that their increased financial support was urgently needed. Then, after Hutchins had left, Grove turned to Brundles and said, "So what's the deal on all this anyway? Is the school going to fold up or what?" "Shit, who knows? I know my father's looking for another job." "He is?" "Been looking since last spring. And it hasn't been easy. I mean, Northern Connecticut isn't exactly the best place in the world for a chef to find work. And I heard Needler ask the whole faculty to take salary cuts, and they told him to shove it. They're all looking for new jobs too." "They are?" "Dr. Stone told me there have been faculty meetings where they shout and argue and carry on like maniacs. That's the way he put it, and he said they're all in a state of panic." "He did?" "You're a funny guy, Grove," Lothar Brundle said, turning back to his humor column. "I mean, you write pretty well and you always get the paper out, but a lot of the time you don't even know what the hell's going on." Richard Edward Thomas Lear joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in November. There was great applause in assembly on his last day at school, while he stood alone and pressed his moist lips into a frown suggesting the spirit of the volunteer. Several weeks later, and a similar ovation went up for Pete Giroux, who was said to be failing most of his courses and who now planned an immediate enlistment in the United States Marines. And those departures were only the beginning. The federal law that year required every male citizen to register for the draft on his 18th birthday. There was a stipulation for high school seniors. If your birthday came before January, you could be drafted during that month. If it came later, the government would let you stay in school until the normal time of graduation in June. The 3 Dorset seniors who fell into the first category had taken summer school courses to prepare them for a winter graduation. They received their diplomas in a makeshift ceremony one Friday afternoon. One of the 3 was Bucky Ward, and in honor of the occasion, Grove stayed up late with him in the Chronicle office. They self-consciously passed a smuggled pint of whiskey back and forth. It tasted so awful that Grove couldn't imagine the source of its celebrated power to give pleasure, let alone to enslave the soul. But they didn't have a very good time. Ward had recently gotten what he insisted on calling a Dear John letter from Polly Clark. She was engaged to an Army Air Force cadet, and he'd been dramatically morose for days. "I don't care anymore," he announced more than once. "I don't care what happens to me in the Army or anything else. If they make an an invasion of France. I won't care if I'm the first little son of a bitching rifleman on the beach. I mean that. Oh, balls. What do you mean, balls? I'm only telling you how I feel. Yeah, okay, but shit, Bucky, everybody wants to live. Wanna bet? Listen, there are certain conditions of life under which I simply don't care whether my own life continues or not. And the talk went on that way until the small hours of the morning, when Grove had begun to ache for sleep. At last he rubbed both fists in his eyes and said, Jesus, Bucky, you're going to be dead. And Ward looked at him narrowly. How exactly do you mean that? You're going to be dead tired on the train tomorrow, going home. How the hell did you think I meant it? I don't know. I'm not putting any more interpretations on anything anybody says. With Ward gone, Grove was free at last to devote himself to Hugh Britt. Their being roommates had seemed to promise a great advantage, but soon there was trouble. A German refugee boy named Vespal, who was Britt's chief rival for brilliance in the senior physics course, had begun to move in as Grove's chief rival for Britt's time. Vespal spoke English with a Katzenjammer accent that only Britt seemed able to understand, but he was clearly a cultivated boy and intellectual, beyond the reach of any plans Grove might have for himself. All three of them were frightened of hockey, so they joined a large number of students who signed up for the alternate winter sport of open skating. This meant that they had skated in wide, easy circles around the outside of the embattled hockey rink on bitter cold afternoons. Or rather, Britt and Vespal did that, side by side in steady conversation. Always at least 30 feet ahead of where Grove struggled on caved-in ankles, cursing his luck, hating the weakness of his own heart, while the Eagles and the Beavers beat each other's brains out on the ice within the shuddering boards. There was one good thing. Bucky Ward had been the dorm inspector on the third floor of one building, where most of the seniors lived, and Grove was appointed to replace him. It didn't amount to much. Seniors were too old and too nice to make any real trouble, but Grove loved the job. Get him out! He would bellow down the corridor at lights each night, and then turning, get him out! Down the other. And he would check each room to see if anyone was missing. No one ever was. He would stand waiting at the stairwell for Driscoll's ritual visit. Everything okay, sir? And then he would saunter back to the room he shared with Hugh Britt, feeling pretty good. Another good thing was that Vespal, however much of a fireball student he was, and however nimble a skater, couldn't possibly have gotten the Dorset Chronicle out every 2 weeks. And even Britt had to admit that the paper was getting better all the time. The writing was livelier, the editing was more dependable, and the editorial that ran beneath the masthead in each issue often seemed to Grove to be a little triumph of prose composition. Well, but why do you spend so much time on the damn thing? Britt demanded. What are you killing yourself for? The whole school is going bankrupt anyway. Everybody knows that. When the war's over, you think any college in America is going to care whether you put out the paper for some dopey little school that hasn't existed for years? Why don't you pay attention to your grades, Bill? Britt nearly always called Grove Bill now, and that in itself was bracing. Whenever he slipped back into calling him Grove, Grove knew he'd probably said something dumb in the last day or two, and would sometimes lie awake trying to remember what it was. Soon it was time for the seniors to take their college board examinations, and because Dorset was less centrally located than Miss Blair's school, the authorities had arranged for the boys' exams to be given there. This was a vaguely thrilling prospect. Apart from Gus Gerhardt, who was wholly familiar with the place but wasn't talking, nobody knew anything about Miss Blair's except that Edith Stone had graduated from it last year. But didn't it stand to reason there'd be other girls like her? They'd have long, clean hair, and they'd stroll their campus in light flannel skirts and light cardigan sweaters, with their school books hugged close to their young breasts, and they'd say wonderfully engaging things like, "Hi, my name's Susan." Would the Dorset guys take their college boards in a room full of girls? And would they stay for lunch? And would there be time afterwards for strolling with the girls and getting acquainted and maybe making dates for some weekend soon? A long yellow bus stood waiting for them in front of one building, early one chilly morning. It didn't take long to reach Miss Blair's. They got there so soon, in fact, that most of the campus was still shrouded in morning mist. But the building where the bus let them off was plainly visible. It had a long second-story balcony at which 8 or 10 girls stood leaning out on their forearms, all wearing bathrobes. A few with their hair in curlers, and they were smiling and singing to their guests on the sidewalk below. It might have been fine, but then the words of their serenade came through, sung to the tune of the Reluctant Dragon. We are the Dorset Fairies, woo-woo, woo-woo. The girls had composed only those 2 lines, so they sang them over and over like shrill, taunting children as the boys walked past beneath them toward the place on the ground floor where the college board exams lay waiting. It wasn't fair. Dorset Academy was a funny school. Everybody knew that, but Dorset Fairies? How could something like that have gotten into their minds? Grove squared his shoulders and walked with an exaggerated manliness to prove he couldn't possibly be a fairy, and he saw Dave Hutchins walking just ahead of him was doing the exact same thing. He glanced quickly around to see how others were taking it, and he spotted Gus Gerhardt bringing up the rear of the wretched parade and blushing foolishly, just as one of the girls broke out of the song to call, "Oh, not you, Gus, not you." There were no girls in the room where they took the college boards, which lasted all morning and proved to be much more difficult than most of them had expected. And no plans had been made for them to stay at Miss Blair's for lunch. They climbed back into their bus, the upstairs balcony was empty now, and rode back to Dorset Academy with a sickening new awareness of what the term funny school might be taken to mean. Nobody wanted to talk about the girls and their song, and so it was never discussed. There had been 3 or 4 air raid drills a year in that part of Connecticut since the war began. By now, they'd long become as much a matter of routine at Dorset as fire drills in a grammar school. But they were a nuisance. Faculty families had to turn their living rooms into shelters for unwieldy numbers of boys. Robert Driscoll had to run around the campus like an air raid warden. The whole student council had to report for duty-taking roll calls in the shelters, then prowling to look for chinks of light. And there was an air raid drill in the spring of 1944 when everything went wrong for Dave Hutchins. The trouble started that afternoon when his roommate, Gus Gerhardt, saw him fitting a cone of heavy red plastic over the face of his flashlight. "What are you doing that for?" Gerhardt said. "Air raid drill tonight." "Shit, what are they going to do? Send long-range bombers over from Berlin tonight? Or are they coming from Tokyo?" "Come on, Gus, it's just the thing we have to do." "Who says?" "Well, hell, I didn't make the rules." "You didn't? I thought you made all the rules around here, Mr. President." "Look," Hutchins said and dropped the flashlight on his bed. "This thing of calling me Mr. President is okay once in a while, when I know you're kidding, but it's getting to be a pain in the ass." "Oh," Gerhardt turned his big head away to stare out the gray window. "Well, sorry, Mr. President." And he kept it up all through dinner. "Wait till you see our president out there tonight," he said to several other boys at the senior table, well within Hutchins's hearing. "Think he'll let those long-range enemy bombers turn us into rubble? Wrong. He'll never let those long-range enemy bombers turn us into rubble." By the time of the drill itself, Hutchins was badly shaken. He vowed he wouldn't risk seeming to pull his rank tonight, and to keep that promise, he stayed well apart from the rest of the student council guys. He was standing alone in the darkness near a 4 building with his flashlight turned off, hiding from responsibility and waiting for the damned thing to be over, when Pop Driscoll came up to him and said, "Dave, is that you?" "Yes, sir." "How come those guys haven't turned their lights out over there?" And Hutchins knew what he meant. Over in front of 2 building, the whole width of the quadrangle away, the red-coned flashlights of the assembled student council glowed like burning cigarettes in the dark. Hutchins had stood here for 10 minutes hearing the distant sound of Gerhardt's voice in the rhythm of a comedian's, setting up punchlines. And at the expected intervals he'd heard all their laughter rise and break and fall away. "Hey, you guys," Driscoll called. "Lights out over there. Lights out." But they couldn't hear him across the quadrangle. It was a windy night and the trees were making a lot of noise. "Dave," he said, "run on over there and tell him to douse those lights, okay?" Hutchins would have given anything for the courage to say, "You go. You go, Pop." But he went himself, jogging across the dark flagstones. He began as he approached them, and that brought on a happy chorus of, "Look," he said, "Mr. Driscoll wants you to turn off your flashlights." "Okay, Mr. President," several voices said. He had turned away even before he heard that and started to run back toward 4 building, but he didn't make it. He had to stop in the very center of the quadrangle where he could only hope the big trees would muffle small sounds, and burst into tears against the heel of his hand. It seemed very unlikely that any other president of the student council had ever done anything like that. For Driscoll, the most annoying thing about air raid drills was that they disrupted the normal process of getting the kids bedded down. Sometimes it was more than an hour after lights before all the dorms were quiet. But tonight his rounds went fairly smoothly. It wasn't until he hit the second floor of 3 building that he found anything wrong. The dorm inspector, a 4th former named Frank Bishop, wasn't there to greet him on the landing. And when Driscoll stepped inside to peer down both halls, he felt a chill around his heart. One hall was dark and quiet, but the other, and this was Bobby's hall, was loud and bright with the light flooding out of a single room. It was Bobby's room. And as Driscoll hurried there, his shoes crunching a few spilled Ritz crackers on the floor, he wished he could remember some of the Catholic prayers of his childhood. "Oh, God, help me," was all he could manage. Bobby Driscoll, fat, naked, and 15 years old, lay splayed on his back across the bed. His face was hidden by a fully dressed boy who was sitting on it. 4 other fully dressed boys were pinning his limbs down, and one of them was rhythmically pumping his stiff, swollen prick in his hand. The boy doing the job looked up. It was Frank Bishop, and with a funny little twitch of mortified surprise in his face, he said, "Oh, hi, Pop." "Everybody out," Driscoll said in the doorway. All the moisture had gone out of his mouth, but he could still speak. "Everybody out of here fast and wait for me in your rooms. I'll be around to see you all shortly, and here's a piece of advice. You damn sure better be there." Released from bondage, trying to hide his erection with his hands, Bobby skittered into bed, pulled the covers up, and flopped over to face the wall. His straight, sweaty hair stuck out in all directions. Nothing could be seen of his expression except that his temple and cheek were pink with shame. Robert Driscoll closed the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and extended one hand to hold his son's shoulder. It seemed a long time since he had done that. "Listen, Bobby," he said. "I want you to listen to me. This doesn't matter. Do you understand me? This doesn't matter. It's just a dumb little thing that happens in prep schools. And the point is, I don't want you worrying about it, Bobby. I don't want you thinking there's something wrong with you or anything like that, because there's nothing wrong with you. Do you understand me? It was you this time, and it'll be somebody else another time. It's just a dumb little prep school thing, and it doesn't matter. Don't let it make you worry about yourself. Will you promise me that? Do you understand me, son?" Then he was out in the empty hall, the flashlight slippery with sweat in his hand. It was time to face the other boys in their rooms, one at a time, starting with Frank Bishop. And the trouble was that he didn't know what the hell he was going to say. But he had made up his mind on one thing anyway. As long as he lived, he would never tell Marge about this. Mr. Gold broke out the largest typeface in the shop, never used before, in order to fill Grove's requirements for a front-page banner headline in the Chronicle's issue of April 20th, 1944. Dorset Academy will close. Beneath that, down the top of the right-hand column ran a three-line bank. Needler cites insurmountable fiscal troubles. And then came the story, written exactly as Needler had asked for it, personally approved by him after 3 close readings, revealing nothing and enlightening no one in 7 dense paragraphs with a run-over on page 2. Grove's editorial in that issue spoke with what he hoped was the eloquence of our feelings and our emotions on having our worst fears confirmed. It wasn't one of his better editorials. He explained for days to anyone who would listen that it would have been better if he'd had more time. With the news out at last, a sense of relief settled over the school. All anxiety and dread had come to an end in the luxury of collapse. Marge Driscoll was vacuum cleaning her rugs one morning, preparing them to be rolled up and stored for the summer, when it occurred to her to think, no, wait, we won't even be here this summer. Then she decided the rugs had better be rolled up anyway for the moving van that would take all their stuff to wherever they'd be going. And it was another little shock to realize, as if for the first time, that she didn't know where they'd be going. She switched off the vacuum cleaner and sat for a long time in a slowly settling cloud of house dust, thinking it over. She was still doing that when her husband came home and said, "Honey, listen. Can you listen a minute? This is pretty important." And he told her he'd just come from Needler's office. Needler had secured a job for himself as headmaster of a small new prep school in Michigan. It must have been something he'd worked on for months during those protracted drumming up trade trips of his. And this morning, just now, he said he had learned there was a vacancy for an English master out there, too. "Oh?" Marge said. "So first I tried to ask him about the school, and it turned out he doesn't really know much. I think he's so glad to have a job he doesn't care. All he could tell me was that it's a good school. Oh, and he told me they have interscholastic sports because he knew I'd like that, which of course I do. And he said he couldn't quote the actual salary figure they'll be offering, but he said he was pretty sure it would be all right." "I see," Marge said, carefully smoothing her skirt over her thighs. "Well, Bob, it's up to you. We'll talk it over some more, although of course it's too bad we don't have any more information. And I think we ought to discuss it with Bobby too, don't you? He's old enough to have a part in making decisions like this. And then after we've all talked it over, you decide. Because you see, in a thing like this, Bob, all Bobby and I can do is help you make your decision. Ultimately, it's up to you." "Yeah," Driscoll said, looking tired. He took off his glasses, closed his eyes, and pinched the bridge of his nose hard between thumb and forefinger. "Yeah, well, listen. Don't get mad, Marge, but here's the thing. I already said yes. I already talked to the Michigan guy on the phone, and I said yes to the whole fucking deal." 3 or 4 days later, on her way to the post office, Marge felt reasonably good. Things could be worse in this warm, wartime spring. It wasn't as if Bobby were of military age. "Hi, Mom," one of the younger boys said, passing her in the quadrangle. It troubled her that she couldn't think of his name, but she put a little extra brightness into her answering "hi" to make up for it. Then she saw Alice Draper up ahead and hurried to fall into step with her. "How are you doing, Alice?" "Oh, fair, I guess. Been doing a lot of typing. How about you?" "Well, there's been quite a bit of typing in our house, too," Marge said. That was a lie, but she'd promised Bob she wouldn't tell anyone about the Michigan job. It was startling to see how shabby Alice Draper looked, as though she'd stopped taking care of herself months ago. Even now, Marge wasn't sure if she had ever approved of Alice's affair with Leprade, and she'd felt awfully sorry for Jack, as everyone had. But it couldn't be denied that Alice had looked better in those days. She'd been better company, too. Since then, she had grown so drab, inside and out, that these little how you doing talks were all Marge could muster for her. Even on their occasional shopping trips to Hartford, when Alice had once been all vivacity and urged Marge along with her until they giggled like schoolgirls all the way home, even those trips were dull and mostly silent now, and a relief to be done with. "Oh, look, that's nice," Marge said in the post office. "You've got a letter from John Paul." "Ah, yes," Alice said in a flat voice. "That'll be pleasant for me, won't it? A little light in my life." And Marge felt, well, irritated. Alice being cynical about John Paul? Was there now nothing she wasn't cynical about? Could a person really be cynical about everything in the world and still expect to have friends? "I'll see you, Alice," she said. "See you, Marge." Then Alice Draper moved away toward home, walking very slowly in order to read the badly typed, single-spaced, 3-page letter. And so I remain at my desk in Washington, wearing captain's bars but performing duties more appropriate to a corporal. My colleagues are mostly enlisted men, former graduate students and such, who openly resent my rank and pay. Yet every time I ask our commanding officer about an overseas assignment, I am answered condescendingly in a language neither English nor French, but pure U.S. bureaucratic. No openings are contemplated in the foreseeable future. And oh, Alice, are you aware of what a deadly place this capital city of yours is? Everything here is spam and powdered milk and slow, hideously overcrowded taxicabs. Alice, I hesitate to bring this up. It may only drive us further apart. But there has been a chilling tone of indifference in your last few letters that I can neither account for nor understand. When you say, for example, that you are tired of feeling sorry for me, I can only interpret that as meaning you find my unhappiness boring. Can this really be the voice of the woman I knew? If so, where did it all go? The passion and the love that nourished us both for so long. I knew from the start, of course, when we first met, that you found me romantic, only because your own life had grown dull. And so at any point in our time together, I might easily have said I was tired of feeling sorry for you. Do you see the irony here? Do you see the unfairness? Love is nothing unless it includes friendship. And how can we be friends, Alice, if I must sense in your letters the dwindling and cooling of your interest in me? Let me put it this way. Unless I soon receive a letter conveying some of the old vitality, the old spark, some suggestion of the Alice I knew, I will have no choice but to sever our correspondence. I hope. Alice finished reading just in time to pause at a big rusty trash container out in the sandy area behind Ford Building. She tore the letter into halves, into quarters, and into eighths. Then she threw it away and went home. Several hours later, she was typing steadily, well into the rhythm of it, making almost no mistakes and beginning to feel a sense of accomplishment. Did professional typists feel this after their first few days on the job? But something had begun to bother her about the material she was typing. Jack Draper had come home a while ago from his final class of the day. He was in the kitchen finishing his second drink when he heard her machine clatter to a stop. For days now, more days than he wanted to count, Alice had worked and worked on this borrowed typewriter in the living room, making many copies of his letter of application and his employment resume. When you wrote down the names and addresses of all the private secondary schools in America, and who cared which of them were good schools or bad schools, or any of the different kind of funny schools in between, you ended up with quite a long list of places to apply to for survival, and that meant a great deal of typing. Today, he discovered, on going into the living room, she had worn an old pair of slacks for her work, and a badly frayed shirt that had once belonged to him, and she'd put her hair up for business, under a hastily tied rayon bandana that wasn't quite clean. "Jack," she said over her shoulder, looking briefly and only partially away from the typewriter as he came in. You know this last paragraph of the resume where you explain about your handicap? Well, look, of course I understand why you put that in, but don't you think the resume might be stronger without it? Because of course most people aren't going to care, but there could easily be someone who might, and then you'd lose out on the job. Oh, he said, standing on the carpet 10 feet behind her chair. You want me to misrepresent myself? I don't see it as misrepresentation at all. Under the circumstances, considering the spot we're in, I think it's only common sense. She was staring at the typewriter. Okay, he said, fuck it. I don't care what the fuck you do with it. Do whatever the fuck you want. And not even that dreadful little accumulation of fucks was enough to make her look up. She began typing again. He was determined that she'd look at him at least once before he left the house. And so, with one unsteady hand on the knob of the front door, he said, Alice? She turned around in a distracted way, her fingers tucking damp strands of hair up under the bandana. Her face, at that moment, looked weary and plain. Alice, I want you to know you're a lovely girl. And he didn't even wait to see her expression. Bored, puzzled, pleased, before he went outside and shut the door behind him. Not a bad line, he thought as his heels crunched the red pebbles of the walk to the science building. Later, when she thought about it, she might even come to understand that it was the best possible thing he could have said. When he'd locked himself into the chemistry lab, no helpful young Mackenzie would find him this time. He stood for a while, absorbing the silence and the shadowed emptiness of the place, with its pervasive smell of sulfur and the murmurous ghosts of its many, many classroom voices over the years. A faucet was dripping somewhere in the back. Apart from that, there were no sounds at all. 12 or 15 matching chairs and small tables of lightweight blonde wood were arranged to face the teacher's desk in a loose classroom formation. And he selected one chair and table set that had been shoved against the wall. He calculated the height of the chair, the height of the table, and the height of an overhead steam pipe under the low ceiling. These hazards could be overcome, even by a funny little man who would have to stop and tremble and gasp for breath at each stage of his climb. Kneel on the chair first, his funny little body counseled him. Bring one foot up, good, and now the other. Take your time. Now hold on to the wall, steady, and stand. Good. Now the table. Kneel first, one foot up, hold the wall, now the other foot. Stand. Wow. It might have been dizzying to stand erect on a tabletop and see the chemistry lab from this odd new perspective, but nothing on earth could have made Jack Draper queasy now. He felt triumphant. One of the better things about Brooks Brothers was its line of leather belts. Supple, sturdy, made in England, they were more than adequate for holding up your pants. You could pass the buckle end of one over a convenient steam pipe, make a loop and pull it tight. Then bring the other end around your neck and tie it in a firm, excellent knot at the side just under one ear. Okay, Alice, Jack Draper said aloud into the empty room. Okay, baby, I love you. But he couldn't kick the table away. Any normal man with normal legs could easily have sent it crashing in less than a second so that he'd drop and catch and spin, and the whole fucking world would end forever. But Jack Draper stood trembling and helplessly alive, treading the table in his pitiable shoes. He could work a toe back under the rear edge of the table, but didn't have the strength to upset it that way. He could work a heel over the forward edge, but couldn't turn it over that way either. Come on, he said, almost whimpering. Come on, come on. And for what seemed half an hour, though it was probably more like 10 minutes, he tried and tried. He would rest, sweating, breathing hard, gathering strength, and try again. No luck. Draper, "Draper, you're an idiot," he said. "You're an asshole. You can't even do a simple fucking thing like this." The knot of the belt had begun to creak faintly under his ear with each breath. The only way to stop the creaking was to untie it. When he'd done that, the belt looked so wretched dangling from the pipe that he took it down. And getting down, for reasons he didn't even try to understand, was harder than getting up had been. Bracing himself against the wall as he lowered one badly shaking foot to the chair, he was terrified that he might crumple and fall. Wasn't this the goddamnedest thing? When he was safe on the floor at last, working the damned belt back through the waist loop of his pants, he knew only that he was ready for a drink. And he wouldn't settle for the warm piss from the tank here in the lab either. He would have bourbon, in a big glass with plenty of ice, and he would have it seated at the kitchen table of his own home like a man. There was barely time to fix the drink and to settle down with it before Alice came to stand in the kitchen doorway. She looked troubled and oddly shy. "I decided you were right about that," she said. "Right about what?" "That place in the resume where you tell about your handicap. I was wrong, that's all. And I'm sorry." "Oh, okay. Because of course it's better your way. It's more honest and more courageous. I don't know. I'm sorry, that's all." One of her pale, slender hands came up to clasp the other at her waist. The two hands writhed together there while she seemed to gather courage. "Jack," she said. "Yeah?" "That was nice, what you said." "What'd I say?" That I'm, a lovely girl." And she started to cry, but recovered quickly. If she cried, she explained, wiping her tears, she wouldn't be able to talk. And oh, there were so many things to say. Would he mind very much if she came over and sat with him? This couldn't be real. Good whiskey in his veins, with plenty more where it came from. Alice close and warm beside him for the first time in God only knew how long, pouring her heart out in an avalanche of tenderness. And all he had to do was sit here and let it happen. Sit here and take it in. Wow. "And Jack, remember when you first came out of the hospital and you kept saying, 'Baby, I'm a basket case.' And do you remember what I said?" "No." "Oh, I was hoping you'd remember, but if you don't, I'll tell you. I said, you're just the kind of basket case I've wanted all my life." Well, all right, swell, he thought. That's nice. She's sorry. She wants to come back. We'll kiss and make up like people in the movies. But what are we ever going to do about the year and a half with Frenchie Leprade? And while he was in this cool, discriminating mood, it occurred to him that he might as well admit she wasn't really a very pretty girl. She probably never had been, except in his own lust-crazed vision, even in the best of the old days. There was too much nervous motion in her face, for one thing. Besides, wouldn't it be better if her eyes were just a tiny bit farther apart? And besides, didn't everybody know that a girl of her age could hardly be called a girl anymore? Oh, a woman could be splendid too, of course. Everybody knew that. But what about a woman who had opened her legs 3 and 4 times a week for a year and a half to welcome a muscular, posturing son of a bitch who probably looked, when naked, like an old-time photograph of the male model in the life class of some third-rate Paris art school at the turn of the fucking century? Oh, yeah, there was the hell with it. There was the trouble. What would they ever be able to do now about Frenchie Leprade? "And you're such a brave man, Jack," she was saying. "Oh, I know you hate that. You've always said handicapped people hate to be called brave. But I don't mean it in that sense alone. The way you sort of carry on. The really gallant way you face each day in this awful, awful little place. Oh, and Jack, have you any idea how much the children love you?" It was the word children that tore him apart and made him feel good at the same time. Children was the word that sent blood flowing heavily into his groin, filling his prick so that the only thing in the world to do was scrape back his chair and struggle to rise. Alice helped him, murmuring something sweet that he couldn't quite hear. She put her arm around his back. She took and held his funny little hand and matched her steps to those of his funny little feet, and they walked together carefully to their bed. Abigail Church Hooper let it be known to Needler, through her lawyers, that she wished to invite the senior class to her home for tea some afternoon before the end of school. "It'll be a chore, Bob," Needler said to Driscoll, "but there's no one else I'd trust with it." And so, in a short parade of cars, with Driscoll driving the first one, the class rode the 10 miles of highway to the old Hooper's estate. None of them had ever seen it before. She had evidently bought or built her home before developing her passion for Cotswold architecture. The mansion was Victorian and ugly. Not even the elegant blue awnings of all its many windows could save it. But it certainly did look like money. A middle-aged manservant appeared on the freshly raked pebble driveway to tell Driscoll where the cars were to be parked. Then Driscoll and the boys were inside the place, walking down a long, wide hall hung with brown oil paintings. And suddenly there she was, a small, fat, old woman in purple, seated with her knees well apart and with her back to the far wall of a big paneled room. A cane rested against one arm of her chair. "Driscoll," she said, extending one liver-spotted hand, palm down. "That's an Irish name. Are you from Boston?" "No, ma'am, I come from New Jersey." "Oh, well, but then it always has been difficult to keep track of the Irish, hasn't it? Is this really the whole of the senior class?" "It was a small class to begin with, Mrs. Hooper," he said, "and several of the boys have left to join the service." They were already forming a ragged line to one side of the old lady's chair. They seemed to sense what was expected of them here, and Driscoll introduced them one by one as they filed past and took her hand. "Weaver," she said, "that's a good English name." "Van Loon? Oh, that's a fine old Dutch name." A maid came in, trundling a big tea cart. There would be a tea and tiny squares of sponge cake to ease their discomfort in this house. And for 20 minutes or so the boys were left to themselves. They wandered around the room and back into the front hall to inspect the decorations. Then Driscoll tapped Dave Hutchins on the shoulder and said Mrs. Hooper was ready to talk to them all. "Okay, sir," Hutchins said, and turning away he called, "Hey, you guys, you boys." And Driscoll got a chuckle out of that. Little Dave Hutchins, president of the student council and certainly the most agreeable kid in the school, had been afraid that "you guys" might be just the note of strident vulgarity that could make this mansion crumble and fall. They gathered around her then, most of them sitting on the carpet. Nice kids, polite kids, kids whose fathers had spent far too much to send them through a funny little school that nobody ever heard of, who only last month had learned their school was bankrupt, and who very likely did feel some of the emotions described in Grove's fervid editorial, but who, for the most part, bless them, probably didn't give much of a shit. "Gather round me, boys," Mrs. Hooper said, as though she'd rehearsed that line and was determined to deliver it, even though they'd already gathered around her. "I'm very glad to see you all today, because you're the last graduating class of what I shall always think of as my school. I always wanted to be a boy, you know. Oh, yes." And here her puckered lips came apart to reveal glistening, smiling false teeth. "Oh, yes. As a child, as a girl, I always wanted to be a boy. Because men do things in the world. You see, men run the world. And so, not long after my late husband's death, I had a dream. I dreamed of a school for boys that might be just the kind of school I'd have wanted if I'd been a boy. Do you see? Well, it's all gone now, isn't it? But I want you to know I tried to save it. I tried for years. I don't wish to discuss your mad needler today because I have my blood pressure to think about. But I'll tell you this much. He never understood Dorset Academy. He never understood Dorset Academy at all. So now it's gone. All my years of work and planning, all my devotion, all gone. And I understand you boys are going into the army and that sort of thing. Well, my father was a cavalry officer with General Burnside in the Civil War. He was decorated 3 times, and oh my, he was a handsome figure. I'll never forget how fine he looked on horseback, even in later life. He was a man born to ride. And now, of course, there's no cavalry anymore, is there? So you boys will miss all that. I expect you'll be pushing automatic buttons sort of thing in this dreary war of Mr. Roosevelt's. I call it Mr. Roosevelt's war, you see, because I believe it's only part of his plan to turn us all into communist Negroes. Have you thought of all that? You may ask how it's possible to turn people into Negroes, and I'll tell you. The male Negro has an enormous procreative power. That's his one great advantage over most white men, you see. And then, of course, there will always be impressionable white girls. So you have 2 or 3 generations of communist propaganda, you see, and there you are. Well, Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy? Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry. My name's Driscoll. Yes. Well, unless some of the boys have questions, I'm feeling a little tired. There were no questions. Going home, going back to school, Driscoll turned once from the wheel of the first car in their little motorcade and started to say something like, "Guess you guys are glad to be out of that sweatbox, huh?" But he swallowed the impulse. It wouldn't have been tactful. It wouldn't have been what Needler called discreet. Besides, the boys did seem to have gotten through the afternoon with no great strain. They had chewed their sponge cake and sipped their tea and listened with apparent patience to the old woman's talk. It may not have been much worse than paying a dutiful visit to their grandmothers, if they had grandmothers. And some of them, come to think of it, probably came from families rich enough to have grandmothers every bit as awful as that. There was one final announcement concerning Dorset Academy's bankruptcy. The United States Army, Needler said at assembly one day, had leased the buildings and grounds, the physical plant of the school, to use as a rehabilitation center for blinded veterans. The men and their medical staff would begin to occupy the premises immediately after graduation. That was a nice break for Grove. It gave him the material he'd lacked for his editorial in the commencement issue. He worked on it for days. When the final draft was finished, just before the deadline, he offered it up for Britt's approval. A salute. It is fitting that Dorset Academy, on delivering its final senior class to the war, will now serve to accommodate blinded Army veterans. Men who have lost their sight in combat can hardly be expected to take comfort in a greeting of any kind, as they feel their way into a dark and bewildering new place. Even so, the class of 1944 would like to offer them this assurance. There is nothing to fear here. We here before you have seen it all. We have seen the play of sun and shadow on the blood-red stone and sweeping slate of these beloved buildings. We have seen the trees. We can watch one another rise today to take our diplomas. We can remember how each of us looked in saying goodbye. Our vision will guide us through military training, but soon, as we move out to the battlefronts of the world, there will be no further certainties. We will then enter into our own time of blindness, if not in the physical, surely in the spiritual sense of the world. Surely in the spiritual sense of the word. And when we come back, if we come back at all, it will be to find ourselves forever changed. You, the young soldiers soon to occupy our dormitories, have far less reason for hope than we do. But our hope is qualified too. And so, in a spirit of comradeship, we salute you. Welcome, veterans. Blind though you are, embittered though you may be, rest well here and learn what you can. This place is yours. That's nice, Bill, Britt said. I think it's the best one you've done. Well, it sure as hell ought to be, Grove said. It took me about 49 fucking hours. There's just one thing. In the third paragraph, I'd take out beloved before buildings. You don't really love the buildings, do you? I guess not. Okay, Britt said. It'd be stronger without that word, but the rest of it's very nice. In the Stones' house, it was Edith who did the typing. She was good at it. She had worked all year as a secretary in the headmaster's office, and the sound of her steady, rapid drumming on the machine seemed a terrible reproach to her mother as she puttered aimlessly in the kitchen or tried to rest upstairs. Didn't everyone need and deserve to feel useful sometime? Even if only near the end of a lonely, neglected life? Oh, they'll miss me when I'm gone, Myra Stone thought. But the worst part was that she couldn't even be sure of that. Dr. Stone spent much of his time on the telephone. Application letters and resumes were all very well, but for a man of his age with his credentials, a decent job was more likely to come about through personal contacts. Howard, Edith heard him saying, Edgar Stone here. Oh, we're all well, thanks. And how have you been? How's Ellen? Good. Howard, there's been something of a disaster here. The school's gone bankrupt, and I wondered if you might know of any... What? Oh, the usual sort of mess. Years of mismanagement and so on, but I was wondering if you might know of any... Edith got out of the house before waiting to hear the end of that conversation. It was too much like all the others that had come to nothing, and set off to take her finished stack of mail over to the office, where she would place it in the outbasket. On her way there in the quadrangle, she looked up to find she was walking beside a boy she had always rather liked and never paid much attention to. Bill Grove. He was out of breath. Apparently he'd been running to catch up with her. Hello there, Bill. Hi, Edith. There were people who said Edith Stone had looked awful since Larry Gaines's death, but she still looked pretty nice to Grove. That's a funny thing, she said. I was just thinking about you. You were? Because my father was talking about you last night. He thinks you're a good writer. He does? Oh, come on, you knew that. People who are good at something never need to be told. Anyway, I wanted to wish you a lot of luck in the service. When do you think you'll be going in? Oh, right after graduation, I guess. Well, look, she said, coming to a stop at the little path to the office, and she swept back her hair with one hand in order to look up at him. I may not see you again before school's out, so take care of yourself, okay, Bill? Thanks, and you too. You too, Edith. He hoped she might pause on the path and turn back to wave, or maybe even to blow him a kiss. That would be a marvelous thing to take into the army. But she went on walking all the way to the door and inside, her hair floating at her sweet shoulders and her skirt shifting nicely around her legs. Then it was the last day of school. Classes were only a formality, and some of the masters barely managed to turn up for them. But it was considered important to keep everyone on campus because tomorrow was commencement day. Parents would be arriving from all over, mostly of them scarcely able to hide their indignation. What parents, after all, would ever have sent a son to this school if they'd had any idea it was failing, that it would hit the skids and go down and out like some sleazy little commercial venture? And the commencement ceremony itself, no matter how hard everyone tried, would almost certainly be a lame and awkward thing. Still, they would all have to go through with it. Robert Driscoll was uneasy all day about the possible kinds of trouble there might be in the dormitories that night. But nothing prepared him for what he found on his rounds. Almost the whole of the sixth form, the graduating class, was missing. Henry Weaver and two other social outcasts were the only seniors in their rooms. Is this supposed to be some kind of prank or what? Driscoll asked, letting his flashlight stare into Weaver's wincing, blinking face. Where are they, Weaver? I don't know, sir. And Driscoll decided to drop the beam of flashlight to Weaver's chest. Even a pariah might have sensitive eyes. Then Weaver said, You might try Ed Slovak's house, the guy that works in the power plant. You know him? He's friendly with a few of the guys. There was some kind of talk about a party there. Oh, okay, thanks. And Driscoll did know Slovak, a big smiling man in a dirty t-shirt. always scratching his armpits as if it had never occurred to him that taking a bath and changing his shirt might get rid of the itch. The Slovaks lived in a raw clapboard bungalow, strung with many electrical wires, on a patch of bald earth just inside the woods a few miles down the road. Driscoll had started up his car before he realized that a car wouldn't do the job. Instead, he went to the school garage and got the big yellow pickup truck. The Slovaks' house was ablaze with light when he brought the truck bouncing to a stop in the turnaround of its dirt driveway, and he could see the heads and shoulders of many boys inside. But he was greeted at the door by a haggard Spanish-looking man of about his own age, one of the kitchen help, still wearing the stained whites of his day's work. "Nobody here," the man said. "Come on, I'm from the school," and Driscoll showed him the extinguished flashlight in his hand from the hip as if it were a badge. They were all there, in the kitchen and small living room of this crude house with its bright mail-order furniture and its blaring radio, and 4 or 5 other kitchen help men were among them. Mrs. Slovak, a plump woman in a floor-length housecoat and dirty pink slippers, was too intent on fussing with the radio dials to notice his arrival. But her husband, standing near the liquor supply, was very much the jovial host. "Mr. Driscoll," he called. "What's your pleasure, sir?" "No, thanks," Driscoll called back. "Not tonight." None of the boys looked really embarrassed at his entrance. And why should they? How could it really be said now that they were doing anything wrong? With the exception of Van Loon, who was conversing with a befuddled-looking kitchen man, they didn't even seem to have been having a very good time. Some looked drunk. Poor Dave Hutchins looked ready to pass out or throw up or both, but they all faced Driscoll with a suggestion of relief, as though they were glad rather than sorry that he'd come for them. "All right, listen," he announced, raising his voice to compete with the radio. "I think it's about time we broke this up. I've got the truck outside." Then he left the house and stood in the dirt near the open tailgate. He knew they'd come out without coaxing, and they did. "I'm surprised to see you here tonight, Dave," he said, "and you too, Hugh." But Hutchins was too tired or ill to answer, and Britt only gave him a look as melancholy as anything in the Russian novels he'd been reading. "Get on in there," he said as they came singly or in clusters swaying toward the truck. "Get on in there, Jennings, Pomeroy, Mackenzie, Vestball, Van Loon." And finally, the last to leave the party came Grove. For 3 years now, Driscoll had wondered what it was that put him off about this particular kid. Was it just that he couldn't run or throw or catch, or that he daydreamed his way through school and done badly everything but the courses he liked? Well, yes, and then there was his self-dramatizing role as maestro of the damned school paper, and why had Needler let him do that with failing grades? There would probably always be kids like Grove in prep schools. You would find only irritation in trying to help them or to like them, and you could probably never bring yourself to call them by their first names until 10 years later, when they came back to visit the school with their wives. "Well, Mr. Dorm Inspector," he said, "I suppose you realize that under normal conditions, you'd be in bad trouble tonight." "Yes, sir." "Why'd you do this, Grove? Huh? Why'd you want to pull a silly stunt like this?" And Grove lowered his eyes. "I don't know," he said. "We just thought I don't know. I mean, everything's over anyway, isn't it?" "Yeah," Driscoll said. "Yeah, everything's over. Okay." Then, without quite realizing what he was up to, he clapped the boy hard on the shoulder in what anyone would have said was affection. "Okay, Bill, get on in there." And it hadn't really cost him anything to say Bill. How could he have saved that for a better time when there would now be no other times at all? When Grove had vaulted awkwardly into the truck, Driscoll slammed the tailgate and secured it with the heavy little hooks on the heavy little chains. Then he walked around to the driver's seat and started up the engine and set off for home, taking them back to school. There were no lights along the road, and it was speckled with spine-jolting potholes that wouldn't be repaired until after the war. Driving wasn't easy if you weren't used to a truck, and Driscoll was grateful to let that occupy most of his mind. But then he heard them singing. He had known they would probably sing, but he'd expected some war song. One of the bawdy, rollicking soldiers' songs with many verses that every kid in America must know by now, like Roll Me Over or Bless Them All. Instead, in hesitant voices, they had taken up a tame little college boy's beer drinking song that he remembered from his own freshman year at Tufts long ago. Drunk last night, drunk the night before, gonna get drunk tonight like I've never drunk before. There was no readiness for soldiering in this truck, no stern and cocky welcoming of challenges. They sounded, oh Mother of God, they sounded like children. Sing glorious, glorious, one keg of beer for the four of us. And Robert Driscoll was damned if he knew how anyone could blame him ever for what he did then. He slowed down to 25 miles an hour for safety. He hunched over the wheel and held it tight in both hands. He kept one eye open and steady on the road, and he let everything else fall apart inside him while he cried and cried. Afterward. Pierre Van Loon died of shrapnel wounds inflicted by German artillery in the last week of what came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. A month later, on the other side of the world, Terry Flynn was killed in the second or third assault wave on the beach at Iwo Jima. Those with Larry Gaines are the only Second World War deaths I'm certain of among the boys I knew at Dorset Academy. There may well have been others, but without the alumni news column, it was impossible to know. I saw Bucky Ward briefly in 1948 and 47 in 1946 and 47 in New York, and he was full of war stories. He limped a lot, saying he'd been wounded in the knee and he had refused a Purple Heart. But there were embarrassing times when he would walk the streets for miles deep in conversation without limping at all. He talked of having repeatedly volunteered to serve as first scout on dangerous patrols and of taking personal risks that caused other men to say, "No, don't." Twice, he said, once in the Bulge and again at the Siegfried Line, the force of concussion from enemy artillery had blown every stitch of clothes off my back. When the guys got to me, I was lying there naked as a baby. And all of this had sent him home with a profound new sense of his own potential value to mankind. It's only reasonable to wonder why I was saved, he explained, staring earnestly into his coffee in a Bickford's cafeteria at 1 o'clock in the morning. Why me? Out of all those others, why me? Oh, I'll never be sure, I suppose, but I think I know. I think it's Christianity. I think it's Jesus. And so he had resolved to become a man of the cloth. I haven't seen or heard from him in 30 years. I corresponded with Hugh Britt until about 1950, often writing 2 or 3 drafts of my letters to improve the prose. Though he hadn't talked much about it in our last months at school, Britt had been accepted into a Navy program called the V-12 that allowed bright students to enroll as naval personnel in civilian universities, where they could rapidly earn both bachelor's degrees and Naval Reserve commissions. Britt attained those goals soon after the war without ever having left the Middle Western city of his birth. He was also married by then and a father. Next came medical school, for which he was amply prepared, and in one of his last letters he said he thought he would be a psychiatrist. I was the one who stopped writing letters. The strain of trying to keep up with him had worn me down at last. One day, in 1955, I ran into Steve McKenzie walking along Lexington Avenue. We had a few beers and laughed more than we meant to and punched each other's arms. In the end, out on the sidewalk again, I think we shook hands about 3 times in saying goodbye. Just before turning away, he said, "Listen, though. Don't look back too much, okay? You can drive yourself crazy that way." My father has been often on my mind lately, perhaps because in 4 more years I will be as old as he was when he died. My mother is long dead too now, and so is my sister. She died young, but it is my father who haunts me most. I keep trying to picture him as a young man, before the General Electric Company got him, when he was traveling alone around upstate New York and determined to sing for a living. He must have been brave, intense, and more than a little self-important then, yet often tired and ridden with terrible doubts, until he gave up. All I'm really qualified to remember is the sadness of his later life, the bad marriage that cost him so much, the drab little office from which he assisted in managing the sales of light bulbs for so many years, the tidy West Side apartment redolent of lamb stew where I can only hope he found a love before his death. Still, even now, his singing is what I try to remember best, the splendid lyric tenor voice that rang from the walls of my early childhood. Once 10 years ago, driving across the middle of America late at night with the car radio buzzing and crackling in the dashboard, I suddenly heard a high, pure ribbon of sound. And there he was, if only for a moment, a young concert tenor in some town 1,000 miles away. But come you back, when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. Then he was torn away on the air, and the static closed in, and the commercials, and an all-night preacher in Missouri wanting to tell me about salvation, until I turned the thing off and tried to concentrate on the road. If my father had lived, I would certainly have thanked him for paying my way through Dorset Academy. I know he never trusted the place, and for that reason I would have persisted if he shrugged off my thanks. I might even have told him, and this would have been only a slight exaggeration, that in ways still important to me, it was a good school. It saw me through the worst of my adolescence, as a few other schools would have done, and it taught me the rudiments of my trade. I learned to write by working on the Dorset Chronicle, making terrible mistakes in print that hardly anybody ever noticed. Couldn't that be called a lucky apprenticeship? And is there no further good to be said of the school, or of my time in it, or of me? I will probably always ask my father such questions in the privacy of my heart, seeking his love as I failed to seek it when it mattered. But all that, as he used to suggest on being pressed to sing Danny Boy, taking a backward step, making a little negative wave of the hand, smiling and frowning at the same time, all that is in the past.